Okay, everyone, welcome. We are the People's Coalition for Safety and Freedom, and tonight we're going to be having a teach-in on defunding the COPS program. So I want to start, if you know me, I love to start with a little bit of visioning. So we will go to the next slide. So to know me is to know my deep love for Fred Rogers, aka Mr. Rogers. But I just want to say, what a time to be in movement. What a time to be together. 2020, I don't know about you, but it has forced me to sharpen my analysis and to dig deeper than I ever had, to think about the ways that we can live and thrive together. So I want you to think about a thriving neighborhood. This is the time I want you to throw it in the chat. What does it look like? Um, what does it sound like? Who lives in your thriving neighborhood? What are some of your favorite places? So I'll wait for some of that to go into the chat so that we can really talk about what it means to thrive together. Okay, looks like the chat might be disabled. So we will keep going on. We'll keep keeping on. I'm hoping that you think about like your thriving neighborhoods. I'm hoping like me, especially pre-COVID, I live in Oakland. I'm thinking about being in Lake Merritt. I'm thinking about being in the sun. I'm thinking about music and drummers and community. And so for me, I want you to hold that vision in your mind throughout this teaching. Hold on to what it looks like to thrive um, throughout this teaching. Next slide. So we are the People's Coalition for Safety and Freedom, also known as the People's Coalition or PCSF. We are base building organizations and member-led grassroots organizations. We are racial justice policy and advocacy institutions. We are mostly led by Black and queer folks. We represent a cross section of communities impacted by criminalization and incarceration. And we are committed to transforming the justice system and redefining public safety. Next slide. The People's Coalition, if you look, you will see, shout out to the squad, there's BYP 100, the Center for Popular Democracy, Baji, Dream Defenders, Leadership Conference, A Law for Black Lives, Just Leadership, Policy Link, the Justice Team Networks, National Council, and ACRE. Next slide. So our goal is to dismantle and replace racist, harmful, and punitive policies that have fueled the crisis of criminalization and incarceration facing the United States with policies and budgets. And I have this bolded and underlined, if you can see, that invest in communities and decarcerate our country. So it is a very weighty goal, but we think we can do it together. So I want you to go back to that vision of safety and freedom that we had when we first started this. That slide we had with Fred Rogers dancing with a young person, and I want you to note that if we could have seen each other, folks did not say that policing was a way that our neighborhoods thrived. We were not talking about the ways that we criminalize each other, but we were talking about how we work together, live together, laugh together, and support one another. A lot of that is based in this concept of invest divest. And we think about invest divest as if I take $40 million from policing, I can put $40 million into healthcare. And while that's true, Like I said, 2020 has forced me to sharpen my analysis and think bigger and bolder. What I'm saying is we can take $40 million from policing and we can actually put whatever amount that we need to in healthcare. So if healthcare and housing need $100 million, let's take that 40 million from policing and go find that other 60 million where we need to find it, because that's our money and our people deserve it. And so that's what we want to talk about when we're talking about the COPS program and defunding police and defunding cops. We want resources for our community and for our people, not for policing, because policing has never kept us safe. Next slide. So our agenda today, we did an introduction, we grounded, we talked about who we are. So we're going to talk about what the COPS program is. We're going to talk about the history, the local impacts, and why we're talking about it in this moment. Then we have an amazing panel. Y'all, I'm so excited for this panel. I am ready to learn. I am ready to dig in with y'all. I am not overselling them. They are amazing. And then we're going to talk about action steps to defund cops and cages, because we do it, we're getting rid of all of this, right? So we're going to talk about those action steps, and then we're going to go into what's next. Next slide. So right now we're going to throw up a poll. And what I want is for folks to be honest. We are learning together. We are, like I said, we're sharpening our analysis together. So we're going to throw up a poll and really talk about how you feel comfortable. So we'd love for you to give us an answer of how comfortable do you feel talking about the connection between the defund police movement and the COPS program? We're rolling through. About 50% of us have answered. We're going to give a few more seconds for folks to answer. It's coming. We're about 78% there. So if you haven't answered, if you'll do it in the next few seconds, we would greatly appreciate you. Almost there. And so right now, what the numbers are looking like, our people are spread out. So about 27% feel very comfortable, 37% feel somewhat comfortable, and 36% feel not comfortable at all. And so I appreciate the honesty of your answers. Really looking forward to working with y'all throughout this. I'm going to share the results with you, or maybe I'm going to share the results with you, maybe not. And I'm really, really looking forward to digging in so that at the end of this, we could take a poll again and figure out if we made a bigger difference and impact in that. So I'm going to hand it over to Dave Prinkle to go through the COPS program. Thank you all so much.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all this evening. Thank you all for joining us. Absolutely looking forward to having this conversation with you all, and we're going to do our best to share this information with everyone, and hopefully we can walk away all having learned something a little new today and see what we can do with it in our communities and throughout the country. So as Tracy explained, we came together as a coalition of organizations to ultimately repeal and replace the '94 crime bill. I work with the Center for Popular Democracy on the Justice Transformation team. And it's been a journey to learn more and more about how this piece of legislation that was passed almost 26 years ago now continues to impact our communities to this day. And so the '94 crime bill was passed under President Bill Clinton in 1994. It's called the Violent Crime and Control Prevention Act. And it had a couple major components. You can see them listed there. Obviously the COPS program, which is the focus of today's conversation, but it also did a few other things. Authorized $10 billion in subsidies to expand state prisons, implemented things like 3 strikes rules and mandatory minimum sentences, truth in sentencing laws and incentives to make it easier for localities to build more prisons and hold more folks in cages. It ended Pell Grants for folks who were in prisons. It also did a couple things that I think folks might not consider to be the harmful elements, like passing the Violence Against Women Act and then the federal assault weapons ban, were 2 additional components that were packaged in with the '94 crime bill. And so many folks at the time will say that they voted for it because those 2 pieces were a part of the original legislation. But as we can see, the COPS program is a pretty major contributor to the policing crisis that we focus on today. So if we can go to the next slide, actually. Right. So, as again, like I said, this the COPS program is a major component to the policing crisis we see ourselves in today. As the previous slide showed, $19 billion has been funneled through the federal government into our local communities to ultimately increase the amount of police that we see in our streets. If we can go to the next slide. And so that's actually contributed to approximately 100,000 new police officers nationwide. And we're going to go into sort of how the COPS program is able to do that through its grants and funding. But estimates have shown, again, 100,000 additional police officers have flooded into our cities as a result of federal funding that came from the COPS program. Just as recently as last year, we saw Congress continue to appropriate upwards of $300 million towards the program. As the House of Representatives is working to put together a package to deal with the pandemic and to provide relief for our citizens in the wake of the pandemic, an additional $300 million was allocated for the COPS program in what's called the HEROES Act, which is supposed to be a stimulus package to support our communities going through the pandemic, and yet we found a way to put $300 million more into the hands of police. We can go to the next slide. So in addition to flooding our communities with more and more police, it also directly contributed to the school to prison pipeline. As you can see there, $1 billion have gone into policing programs in our public schools as a result of funding that came from the COPS program. That actually ultimately contributed to the hiring of upwards of 7,000 additional police officers in our schools. Y'all may be familiar with the Police Free Schools movement. I'm sure several organizations that are a part of this call have been involved. And as you can see, the COPS program has played a primary role in supplementing police officer salaries and making it easier and easier for schools to put more and more police in their schools as opposed to counselors, nurses, et cetera, et cetera. And we know that police aren't keeping our children safe, but rather all of the resources that go into making schools have all the materials that our students need is actually what keeps them safe. That's where you see the calls for counselors, not cops, in schools. COPS program, as a part of the '94 crime bill, played a primary role in this. Go to the next slide. So why does this matter? As I've said, the COPS program played a primary role in flooding our communities with more and more police, but the reality is billions of dollars from the federal government are flowing into our communities based on putting more cops in the streets. We're at a time of unprecedented social unrest, a recognition of racial injustice, and local governments are actually struggling to find ways to keep their budgets together in the wake of the loss of revenue from the pandemic. And so in the middle of all this, Congress continues to flood our local communities with more police instead of investing in human services, childcare, healthcare, education, infrastructure, all of the things that actually make us safe, community-based alternatives to policing, right? Unfortunately, our elected officials believe that the mechanism to actually solve violence and poverty is more violence on the part of the state and more state-induced poverty in the form of austerity measures. None of this actually contributes to safety in our communities. It just floods our communities, as I've said, with more and more police. Go to the next slide. This is actually a quote from a couple of the folks who work within our coalition. It's from a piece that they wrote in the New York Times called "The Police Are the Problem." And it kind of highlights the sort of underlying thinking behind how the '94 crime bill and the COPS program came to exist, which is essentially a system of oppression. And as we've come to understand, the police, as they're currently functioning, serve to uphold the system of oppression. And the more and more we see the federal government invest more and more money into police instead of the services that our communities actually need to be safe, we can see that that system is just continuously being propped up by these individuals that aren't actually working towards safety and investment in our communities. Rather, they're upholding the systems of oppression that have held our communities down basically forever. Move to the next slide. So one of the primary pieces of the COPS program is this concept of community-oriented policing. The idea is that, policing practices will be improved the more and more that communities are involved with how the police are functioning. So this has been something that's been touted by elected officials as a successful and proven policing practice that can actually greatly improve community safety, as well as trust between residents and police officers. Fortunately, there's no reliable data that indicates that this approach is actually effective. The money that's actually allocated for community policing in reality ends up supplementing more and more police officer salaries at the local level. And so we've seen upwards of 75% of police officer salaries be supplemented by funding from the COPS program. As we know, more police equals more violence and police brutality, and then less money for our communities that actually need to help our communities thrive. And so, in most cases, we see that the primary tools that are used to do this supposed problem solving that the community-oriented policing is supposed to work towards are actually all punitive in nature. And so what you see is officers using threats and arrest powers, and in some cases, they're even partnering with local police departments to evict tenants and padlock businesses through civil legal processes. Very little attempts have been made to actually connect people with the meaningful services or to increase the overall availability of those services. And so what that ultimately leads to is, instead of investing in things like social services and healthcare, we're now relying again on law enforcement to provide those community services, as opposed to the healthcare professionals and the social workers and other individuals that actually, again, provide those services and make our communities safe. And so you see local landlords, business owners, established religious figures all tend to be dominant forces and critical voices in the demands for non-police solutions to local problems, but they were typically ignored, or even they're pushed out of the conversation. And so ultimately what you end up seeing is the overall effect of this is just extends the idea that police are best suited to solve community problems rather than involving those community services that actually do make us safe. Go to the next slide. And so at the end of the day, what ends up happening is federal dollars impact local budgets. And so there's often a struggle to understand how federal policy impacts policy at the local level, especially in a context like this, where we do know that most justice-related policy is implemented at the state and local level, but federal dollars are playing a major role in that local budget allocation. So if you look, increased funding to local governments for the additional hiring of police officers is a direct result of the COPS program. Again, as I said before, 75% of police salaries have actually been subsidized by COPS funding. And then the worst part of this is, after the federal money dries up, local governments are then left on the hook for having to make up those officer salaries, not just the salaries, but all of the benefits and everything else that comes with it. And as powerful as police unions are, it becomes very, very challenging to limit or alter those contracts after the fact. Once the federal government comes in and provides billions of dollars in resources, it's very, very challenging for a local government, for a local city council to then say, oh, we actually want to get out of this contract now. We've seen it happen, and we're going to see panelists talk about some of their efforts to do this locally, but it becomes a very, very challenging thing for local governments to then have to remove themselves from these federal fund structures, because that's what's propped up their community, their police forces this entire time. Go to the next slide. So there are a couple of other federal programs that actually impact the way that police have been functioning throughout the country. One of them is Operation Relentless Pursuit. This is actually a program that, again, was able to receive funding from the COPS program, $61 million that actually went towards bolstering federal law enforcement to go throughout our cities and add an additional flow of police to, quote unquote, assist with community safety. As we know, more police does not equal more safety. And so the fact that the Attorney General, William Barr, among others, under the direction of the administration, can then just decide to flood our communities with more and more federal agents now on behalf of safety, when the reality is this is just another way for the federal government to flood our communities with police that we don't need. In addition, the 1033 program is actually a program that allows for the transfer of military-grade weapons and equipment to local police forces. And so in the wake of what we saw happen with the death of George Floyd, among so many others, and we saw people rightfully take to the streets, they were met with an outrageous militarized response. So much of that is a result of the 1033 program, because these local police forces are able to get a hold of tanks, able to get a hold of SWAT gear, which all is used to essentially shut down and stifle the uprising that we saw in the wake of the death of George Floyd, among others. Finally, Byrne JAG, the Edward Byrd JAG Justice Assistant Grants Program, has arguably contributed just as much, if not more, to local governments being able to hire more police than the COPS program has. And so you see there that Congress has appropriated actually $10 billion over the last 20 years to actually support local police departments. much of that funding, which then goes to policing. Go to the next slide. So there again, you can see, Bill Barr has been given tens of millions of dollars to send federal agents and military equipment to brutalize our people and our communities, essentially at will. And so this, again, all took place with funding from the COPS program. Go to the next slide. So I'm actually going to pass it back to Tracy now to kind of talk a little bit about how this connects to the movement to defund police overall.
Yes, thank you so much, Dave, for that information. Every time I see it, it makes me angry, but it also drives me to want to fight harder with all of you all. So what we know is that defunding the police is not only a budget demand, but it is a moral demand. We know the police do not keep us safe. We know that decision makers have prioritized, as you've seen, giving billions of dollars to things that harm us and disappear from folks from our community instead of the things that help us to thrive. And so criminalization needs to be defunded on every single level of government. So the demand to defund the police can also be seen and shown up in how we defund police on the federal level. This money that is coming from the federal level is going down to police officers, to police unions, to all of these folks in our neighborhood. And so when we are talking about defunding the police, we're looking at local city budgets, but we're also looking at the budgets of the federal government. This is a federal expression of the demand. And right now we're in a moment, again, where we talked about dreaming bigger and being more bold. How do we do that? How do we say that this money that has been appropriated from the government, from the federal government for so long, needs to be put into something that is actually holistic for our communities? And so that is why it connects to the movement to defund police. And we're going to hear more about how that's working in localities throughout this kind of presentation and teaching. So I'm going to give it back to Dave.
Thanks for that, Tracy. If we can go to the next slide. So where are we now and what's next? There are currently several pieces of legislation that are floating about being debated in Congress that are supposedly going to work to address these issues. Some of which we think is a little bit more aligned with what we'd like to see happen, and other parts of it are certainly not aligned. And so right now we're seeing, actually, if we can go to the next slide. So these are some of there's a lot more out there, but we wanted to highlight some of these just because we felt that they fit within the context of the conversation. And so as I mentioned earlier, the HEROES Act was originally passed by the House of Representatives. It still hasn't been passed by all of Congress, but the HEROES Act, again, was meant to address the massive economic sort of devastation that we saw as a result of COVID-19. But unfortunately, they authorized another $300 million for the COPS program in the HEROES Act. And so we are certainly not in favor of any additional federal monies going towards policing in our communities. Thankfully, the Justice Act, which was actually introduced in the Senate by Senator Tim Scott, was actually defeated. That was going to authorize another $7 billion for policing. And that was supposed to be a response to the police brutality that we saw after the death of George Floyd, among so many others. Obviously, $7 billion more towards policing is not what our communities need to be able to be successful and to be able to thrive. As I've mentioned previously, Congress has reauthorized funding for the COPS program every year on an average of anywhere between $200 and $300 million. So again, that's money that's not going to healthcare, it's not going to infrastructure, it's not going to childcare, it's not going to jobs programs, it's going to police forces. $200 to $300 million every year. And just recently, we saw the Commerce, Justice, and Science Appropriations processes, including another $343 million for police forces. This is simply unacceptable. We're seeing numbers upwards of $500 million sometimes. As we said earlier, $1 billion has gone into flooding our schools with more and more police officers. The Burn Jag program has put $525 million into policing. Again, none of this is acceptable. We don't want to see any more federal funding that goes towards flooding our communities with more and more police. Instead, we'd prefer to see funding that invests in our communities as part of what we've often described as the divest invest framework. And so we can actually go to the next slide. And so there's a couple of things that you can actually do to support this effort, right? You can contact your House representatives and your senators and demand that Congress no longer send any federal dollars to local police departments by demanding an end to these federal programs. There are petitions that are out there that are making these demands that we're going to be sharing with you all after this programming and in the coming weeks. And then we're also, asking for you all to identify and support those candidates that have committed to curtailing federal spending on police. There is legislation that's out there that we do support, or there's legislation out there that members of this coalition are working hard to pass. Not all of it is immediately within the frame of defund, but to the extent that there are some accountability measures that we would like to support, we'd prefer that as opposed to billions upon billions of dollars flowing into local police forces. Can actually go to the next slide. So I'm going to actually hand it over to Erica from Law for Black Lives to introduce it to our local campaigns and to our panelists.
Hey y'all, I'm Erica Perry. I use A pronouns. I'm with Law for Black Lives and calling or on the webinar from Nashville, Tennessee. So really excited about this panel. Also extremely grateful to be in community with this great group of speakers to talk a bit about what defund work is looking like at the local level and the relationship between local police budgets and the COPS program. But before we get started, I just want to talk a little bit about the impact on police budgets in specific cities. I think we can go to the next slide. Thanks. So we chose to focus on kind of 4 cities to look more deeply into their local police budgets and the impact of the COPS program on their local budgets. And as you can see, we looked into Boston's budget. And so just want to shout out to our research team and Lorenzo at Law for Black Lives for doing quite a bit of this research. But we looked into the research and saw that the Boston Police Department has received $28.2 million in federal funding, and $17.5 million was from the COPS program. And so, and just to name how many police officers that has included as 325 additional police officers, and there's 325 additional police officers on the streets of Boston, and we know the harm that policing does to our communities. And then we look at Durham and we talk a little, and we see that since 2007, the federal government has given more than $7.3 million in COPS and JAG grants to Durham County and the city of Durham. Then we look to Nashville, where I live, and we see that the police budget has increased by nearly $100 million since 2007. And during that time, Nashville received nearly $20 million in federal grants from the COPS and Burn Jag program. And then we look to New York, and we see that the NYPD has received at least $296 million in COPS grants, and $163 million of that was to hire new officers. And so we know that over the past few years, the police department in New York City has grown at least 6.5%. And just want to name that for New York and Boston, this likely undermates the federal funding received by the NYPD and the city of Boston, because COPS funding also went to the state of New York. And so the money has been difficult to follow. And so I think that's kind of just an important place to start when we talk about local campaigns and local defund work. And so excited to hear from our panelists about the work they are doing locally to defund cops and cages, and the role that federal grants that go to incarcerating us and criminalizing our communities, the role that plays in our work to defund our communities and really create, defund cops and cages and really create safer communities. And so really excited to hear from Jackie Sims, who is a member of the National People's Budget Coalition, Dawn Harrington, who is also a member of National People's Budget Coalition, but tonight is representing National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. Then excited to hear from Dee Dee Jackson, who is with Black Youth Project 100, and then Aldi, who is with Make the Road New York and Urban Youth Collaborative. And so y'all can, panelists, if y'all could go, if you could come on screen, that would be dope. And then we can get into some questions. And so I just want to thank y'all so much for being here, for sharing your time with us to talk a little bit about the work you are doing. And so we'll just jump right in. So the first question is, if you could say your name, pronouns, organization, and talk a bit about the Divest, Invest / Defund work you have been engaging in, and what does defund mean to you? And so we can start with Dawn.
Hey y'all, so my name is Dawn Harrington. I am the Director of Special Projects at the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. And we're committed to ending the incarceration of women and girls. And so some of our, so we have sisters and sister organizations that are moving different divest, invest, invest, divest campaigns all across the country, and including a lot of work around divesting from incarceration and defunding cages. And that includes like jail closure and prison closure campaigns, and the stop of jail construction, jail constructions that are in different stages right now in Florida, Vermont, Boston, Rhode Island, Tennessee. And also we are working to decarcerate through clemency for folks that are long timers that have been impacted by the 94 crime bill with the increased sentences and the mandatory minimums, and all the victims of these federal funds that have been to incarcerate us all across the country. And so also we have a Reimagining Communities campaign, which is about hyper-local organizing. Oh, sorry, I lost my screen. So it's about hyper-local organizing, block by block organizing, where we're working on envisioning what the solutions look like, working on transforming harm and transformative justice, working on building cooperative businesses and mutual aid to meet our needs, and working on just envisioning what does safety look like. And so those are some of the things that we're moving across the country.
Thank you so much for that, Dawn. And just before we go to the next person, could you just talk a bit about what defund cops and cages means to you?
Yes, definitely. So defund cops and cages are core to what we believe as abolitionists. One thing that we know is that cops, courts, and cages don't keep us safe, we keep us safe. And we know that cops in our communities and the courts and the cages, how they've impacted us as people who have been caged before. And so what that means, we know that when we came into the system, we weren't bad people, of course. And we know that we were in communities that were disinvested from, that were defunded. We have education systems that have been defunded all over the years and disinvested from. We have the majority of women that are formerly incarcerated have history of sexual domestic violence. And we know we have interpersonal violence that has trauma that has never been addressed or properly invested in. So the disproportionate investment in locking us up, caging us, and the continual disinvestment in actually meeting the needs for us to be safe, for us to have full lives, for us to be, for our trauma, for our mental health to be addressed, for our illness of addiction to be addressed. We see that the investment has been on policing us, locking us up, and throwing away the key. And so for us, defunding also means that we must decarcerate. It also, because we save money, we defund cages every time we get people out. Because we as taxpayers are paying to lock our community members up. And so that is, and also we have a lot of youth that are parents are incarcerated, and they are going into schools. Aren't even addressing the fact that we know that parental incarceration is an adverse childhood experience, and we have schools that are sharing social workers between 3 different schools that don't have math teachers, don't have science teachers, aren't dealing with this trauma that is created by this system and this disproportionate investment. And in those same schools, we have police, more police than we have social workers, than we have counselors, than we have to address the needs that we have. So it is it's our values are shown in how our local, how our state, and how our federal budgets are spent. And right now, it's off within the values that we believe in. So we just want to have, for us to all understand that the budget is a moral budget. All of our budgets are moral budgets, and to fight for an investment in the success of our people instead of throwing them away.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Don, for reminding us what we want to be investing in and what like our vision is, and that right now our budgets are not reflecting that at all. So you talked a little bit about education and adverse childhood experiences, and so I just want to pass it to Audie to talk a bit about, if you could answer the same questions, knowing that you're working with the Urban Youth Collaborative, and so really interested in your perspective, but just again, your name, pronouns, organization, and some of the divest, investor, or defund work you have been engaging in, and what defund means to you, defunding cops and cages means to you.
Thank you. So peace and love, everyone. My name is Adi. I am a lead organizer with Make the Road New York, as well as a part of the Urban Youth Collaborative. So the Urban Youth Collaborative is the coalition, and Make the Road New York is one of the founding organizations back from 2004. And so, you know, I am grateful to be a part of this conversation, and I feel like this moment is the most important moment to be having this conversation. And so, you know, when to start off, I really want to say that for me, defunding and every other single fight that I've been a part of for the last almost 2 decades that I've been in movement work is the importance of centering youth vision, youth voice, and ultimately youth decision, right, around things that directly impact them. And so that's kind of what I'm gonna get into a bit. And so one thing I do wanna say is that in New York City, the invest, divest work is not new. Back in 2000, Make the Road New York engaged in their first campaign to really just divest money from, there was about $64 million that was set aside for youth jails. But when the youth were asking, where's the money for youth jobs this summer, there was none. And so they fought really hard to be able to remove around $53 million of that. And there are organizations in New York who've been doing invest, divest work longer than that. And then we, you know, fast forward now to 2020, whereas Urban Youth Collaborative, we're really aggressively engaged in our Police Free Schools campaign. And so what that means, especially in the last few weeks, we've been engaged in a rapid moving and aggressive, multi-layered and tactic and decision-making and everything campaign to defund the NYPD. And just to set in perspective, when they went through the budget, I was not surprised to see that New York has received the most amount of money out of all those cities all this time. And so the budget for the NYPD currently stands at $6 billion. And our budget for school safety agents or police in our schools is $450 million a year. So just to really to lay that out. And so the campaign that we were engaged in was to defund $1 billion from the NYPD's expense budget. And so there were different ways we thought about doing that. But one of the big things was removing police from schools. So in New York City, right, the Department of Education pays a majority of the $450 million that is the school safety agent budget, but they are contracted and trained by and part of the New York Police Department. And so, you know, what we're seeing is that not only was that campaign aggressive and emotional and exhausting, but actually, I'll get into this a little bit later, there was a lot of barriers and challenges that we faced. And this is still an ongoing fight. And so just to briefly explain, there are 5,500 school safety agents in New York City, comparison to 2,800 school counselors, social workers. We have the largest school district in the country. We're looking at 1.1 million students, which is massive. But we're also looking at Black and brown youth that go to school every day and have to go through metal detectors, have to be wanded at the door, have to be greeted by police, mostly aggressively, not by name, with sarcasm. I know for me, I was 14 years old and undocumented in a New York City public high school and had also been a survivor of rape and sexual trauma. And one of the first encounters I had with a school safety agent was sexual harassment that turned into something really big. And so I no longer had a sanctuary. School was no longer a safe haven for me. It was somewhere that now I, as undocumented, also had to try to avoid the school to prison and school to deportation pipeline. And so often I say I'm a survivor of that, right? So I went to school and public school and graduated. And now years later, I'm supporting young people who are going through the same fight. And so, you know, 90% of arrests and summons, because in New York City, you can get handcuffed and arrested and given a criminal summons, goes to Black and brown folk. Police are currently first responders to mental health incidents, both in the streets, out of the streets. You know, for us, police-free schools means just that, police-free schools. We don't want any type of police or police affiliation in our schools. We don't need that. And we know that there's proof that says we do not need the police to be safe if our communities are fully resourced and supported. And so that's the same thing for defunding. And we, yeah, I can again explain a little bit more moving forward, but that's kind of the gist for us, what policing in school looks like for us, which is very similar to police for us in the streets, in our subways, in our homes, but also, you know, what the end goal is. And the end goal for us is and has been police-free schools completely. So that's us in New York, and I'll get a little bit more into that fight in another question. So thank y'all again for having me here and for really prioritizing such an important conversation at such a critical moment.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. And, you know, again, reminding us that the work around divest, invest has been going on for decades. And shout out to y'all who've been like this, doing this worthy work for a while. And reminding us of what the vision is for police-free schools in New York. And so now I want to pass it to Didi with BYP 100, who has been doing worthy work in Durham and throughout the country, again, to really defund cops and cages, to give us a vision for a world without police and cages. So I'm going to pass it to you, Didi, to answer the same questions, especially around what y'all are doing in Durham. And so again, you know, name, pronouns, I'll already say your name, but a bit about what divest, invest work y'all have been doing in Durham, and what defund work means to you, or defund means to you.
Yeah, thank you, Erica, and thank you to all the folks that helped to pull this together. I really appreciate the conversation. Again, my name is Didi. I use she, her pronouns. I am the National Director of BYP 100, and we are a national organization of Black 18 to 35-year-old movement builders, activists, artists, organizers, all of that, really building towards Black liberation and freedom. And so across the country, we are moving campaigns that are under the Divest Invest framework, and have been for a while, around different ways that criminalization shows up and needs to be divested from. For this conversation, we're talking about specifically police budgets, but just know that there's lots of divest, invest work that can happen and is happening on the ground that isn't just around police budgets. In Durham, myself, along with some other members of our local chapter of BYP 100 and the local chapter of Southerners on New Ground, along with some local organizers, pulled together a campaign called the Durham Beyond Policing campaign in 2016 to respond to the $71 million police headquarters that was being built in our pretty small city in the south of Durham. And so we pulled together always with the framework of there's $71 million going towards this new police headquarters. And if residents in this city had $71 million to spend on their city, it would not be on police. And we know that because we did a survey and proving the data from the residents of the city around what they would do with that money. And no one mentioned the police headquarters, no one mentioned police. And we see many ways that the police are uplifted in our cities, especially cities that have a Black police chief, that have a majority Black police force, that it is this myth that they are good, that they are okay, that they are for our community. And we're proven time and time again that they are not. And also because the police work as not just as an operation of the state, but as a state in of themselves, which is why it is so difficult for people to grasp the idea of defunding them. And it isn't a question when it comes to defunding education. It isn't a question when it comes to defunding healthcare. But when we talk about defunding the police, it is always a negotiation that we have to make. And so our campaign was, we've been going strong for 4 years. And some of that work has looked like pushing for raising the city workers' minimum wage to $15 an hour, which we were able to successfully get passed through our city council within the first 6 months. Pushing for a Durham Beyond Policing and defunding the police has also looked like working in collaboration with the Demilitarized Durham to Palestine campaign in our local city that is really taking a look at the hyper-militarization overall that is happening across and has been happening across the country of our police forces, and how folks are being trained by the Israeli military defense, and how those tactics are being used here on the ground. And we've seen that happen in Ferguson. We've seen that happen in Baltimore in moments of uprising. And so defunding the police also meant a demilitarizing of our police. And in 2018, our city council passed a resolution that they would not cooperate or participate with the Israeli Defense Force. And so there's multiple ways that our campaign has moved, including pushing for participatory budgeting in our city as a mechanism of really democratizing how money is spent in general, to really interrogate how residents are able to even make decisions around where our city budget goes. And there was a push for an increase. This was in 2018. There was a push for an increase in our police budget by $2.5 million, which is the exact amount of money that we asked for to be put into participatory budgeting. And we were able to win $2.4 million allocated into participatory budgeting. So we're the second city in the South to have participatory budgeting, but definitely with the most money. It's barely a drop in a bucket, but it is a start. And so that also goes into what we mean when we say defunding the police. Most recently, last year, our city was pushing to add 72 new cops to the force. And so the campaign and lots of other organizations came together and said, instead of hiring 72 police officers to enforce violence and harm on our communities, why don't you hire 72 community members to build up some alternatives and build a community safety and wellness task force that is able to implement a plan that is an alternative to policing and helps to keep our communities safe. And so we were able to successfully win the fight of them not expanding to 72 new police officers, and also had a proposal at hand ready that was built up from the community that we agreed on, that we were able to push through. I think a good use of this time is to also name the challenges so that folks know what comes up in these campaigns, especially when it comes to building alternatives and trying to push them at the city level, is that you are dragged along in a year, 2 year, just to get the documents, just to get the articles, just to get all of the things that you really want and that the community has asked for on paper and commitment. And so right now our city council said yes to that proposal this year. And then our school board also said yes to our proposal because in there was a push for more funding towards restorative justice programs in our public schools that don't involve the police. And so we had to get the approval of our school board, which we were able to get this past month. And currently we are organizing and pushing around getting it at the county level, which is where our our health services is. And so part of our proposal, it has these different layers and we need all these different approvals. So that is a challenge in and of itself because you're actually working with about 20, well, for our little city, it's about 20 something different targets that we're pushing for just to say yes to our proposal, as if they have another plan, which they do not. Alongside us getting the proposal through, our city also still increased the police budget from $63 million to $70 million this year. And so just because a lot of the folks that are in decision-making power say yes to something that we are pushing for, there's something else that they're saying no to that we're also trying to push for. And so that's the organizing that's happening now. There's a website, Durham Beyond Policing, where folks can, durhambeyondpolicing.org, where folks can look at that proposal. You can download it yourself. You can take it, copy and paste it, use it in your city, do what needs to be done so that we can continue this fight and make a more just and safe community.
Oh, thank you so much, Didi. You said so much, and like I think just super appreciative of what you said around participatory budgeting and for participatory democracy and the role it plays in defund work, and also just super grateful to hear about that y'all are talking to people, because oftentimes, and I think all of y'all said that, like we have been talking to our people are really clear. Tracy started us off with this. Have not said they want to invest in policing. They do not want to invest in cages. They don't want our money. We don't want our money to be spent to incarcerate and inflict violence on our people via policing and incarceration. And also appreciate you lifting up the alternatives work that is like a part of the defund work that I think both you and Don mentioned. And so for this last question, lastly, want to go to Jackie Sims. I know that the National People's Budget Coalition is also deeply focused on participatory processes. And I know that the work that y'all have been doing, / we have been doing, has been centered around Invest, Divest. So we'd love to hear from you, Jackie, to talk a little bit about the Invest, Divest, and Defund work that the National People's Budget Coalition has been doing, and just what defunding cops and cages means to you. And I'll pass it to you, Jackie.
Awesome. The first thing I'd like to say is how grateful I am that our coalition around Invest, Divest is so broad and diverse itself, which means we've got a lot of talent coming to the table for some really hard work that we have before us to do around divesting and reinvesting in things in our community that will be beneficial for us. I think we've spent a lot of time in the last several weeks trying to make sure that we are all on one accord with one vision and speaking with one voice, even though we're coming from different backgrounds. I think we're all in full agreement that the whole culture of policing that has been sold to community is one that's built around a false narrative. It is not one that serves and protects communities of color. It is absolutely more harmful in communities of color as to other communities. So we have to work together to help get that narrative out and to help our people understand why it's important that we begin to pull funds, billions of dollars from law enforcement, and pour that money into our schools, into our transit system, into our healthcare system, into our housing. There's so many places in our city where communities of color continue to exist in deficit. So that's some of the hard work that we have to do. I think it's going to be a little hard. Nashville's an interesting city, and I think it prides itself in being more progressive than I have found it to be. So it's not going to be easy to get the city to reimagine something very differently than what it has been doing. Even for our progressive and more liberal partners, I appreciate the fact that they're coming to the table, but I know they're having a hard time wrapping themselves around an abolition philosophy centered around law enforcement. So that's work that we're going to have to do there as well. Even in community, we're going to help community reimagine, redefine who we are, what our strengths, our assets, our gifts, and our talents are, so that we can exist with one another in community absent violence. And violence really has been taught because it's at the core of who and what America has always been from its inception, which is why we got policing in the first place. So we had our first People's Movement Assembly recently. We got amazing response from that. I think it was kind of inspiring and motivating to see the cross section of people that are coming out and want to work on this issue. But we're going to have to be more aggressive, more intentional about getting more Black and brown people involved in this work, because these are the communities where the work is going to have its greatest impact. So, you know, we've got more strategizing to do around how we build our coalition with more Black and brown people on board. So I'm trying to see what else I may want to get across. Pretty much, I've been involved in law enforcement for a long time, and I need people to understand that where we are, I hope we can help people understand that where we are didn't just happen. Our government does things usually with 10, 15, 20, 25 years of planning. And I think where we are now comes on the back of a lot of things that have taken place in America. Black exploitation movies and the images that were created of who Black people were, and we know they are not. The drug culture that really was created by our government. But we were labeled with a lot of that. We weren't people with drugs and planes and ships and whatnot, bringing drugs into the country and into our communities. That was very, very intentional. And then we had the war on drugs. It was literally a war on our people. And then we end up with community policing, which is really a mirage to lock up and build the mass incarceration system that we see now. So we have to be mindful of all the intentional harm that's been done under, the guise of policing the people who are here to protect and serve. That has not been the situation for our community. And we're going to have to be as intentional as the harm that was done to us. We're going to have to be as intentional in creating new cultures, our own new systems, absent the very predatory law enforcement system that exists today for our communities, so that we can grow and heal and thrive the way we're meant to do.
Thank you so much for that, Jackie, and for like grounding us in the history, and just, you know, for us as the People's Coalition for Safety and Freedom, like we specifically focus on the 94 crime bill because of the role, the COPS program, because of the work that it has done over the past few, I guess, decades to continue the legacy of harming our communities by creating loaded police departments. And so I want to move us into the next question. And just want to pass it to you, start with you, Adi, but what are some wins and barriers, barriers or challenges that y'all been seeing in the work you've been doing in New York?
Yeah, definitely, thank you. And so I'll try to keep it brief because I know we're running low on time. Wins, I would say we've had some pretty significant wins even before the defund police kind of work here in New York City got really, really big. Just years ago, we fought really hard as a coalition to pass the first reporting bill of its kind on our city level to really capture the data of who was being suspended in New York City schools, who was being arrested, what are the demographics, what are they being suspended for, you know? And so we already knew, right, as people who were living and dealing with these experiences, who were the ones, we were the ones being suspended at higher rates. In New York City, you can get suspended for up to 180 school days, which is a whole school year. And so we understood that Black and brown young people who were queer or trans or gender nonconforming, who had IEPs, a lot who were homeless, right? Like a lot of folks that are usually our members and have so much more to them than just what they go through, were often just alienated and really just pushed out of school all the time as a solution. And so we know that that's, you know, obviously not what you should do. And so that came out, and then through that, we've been able to reduce over the last few years other amount of arrests and summonses given in New York City schools by almost 80%. And so we're, you know, through our work, essentially, we are trying to really limit the interactions young people are having with police, to really limit their ability to be funneled into the criminal legal system. And so what we've done is really forced investments in things like restorative justice, which we highly, highly believe in, counselors, social workers, you know, mental health practitioners, things that we know young people need and are critical to really nourish and hold safe space for survival. But also just what's right. It's what's right. It isn't radical to sit here and say we gotta remove police from schools. It's pretty common sense, right? And common sense is tricky, but it's not radical. I'm not gonna sit here and say that's something radical. I'm also not gonna sit here and say defunding the police is something that's radical. It's just something that should be. And so what we're seeing is that although suspensions are down, the disparities aren't. And even if the suspensions are lower, it's still Black young people, especially Black girls, who are being suspended at higher rates here. But you know, there's been some wins in terms of reduction. Challenges, especially in the last few months, there's been a lot of false wins that our mayor and city council have kind of put in their pockets and run away with. They're saying that there was a divestment of $1 billion to the NYPD. I'm sitting here as someone who wakes up every day to figure out how to defund the NYPD, right? To tell you that that's actually false. There wasn't a divestment of $1 billion. To us, divestment is only worthy and working if you reinvest that money back into the communities and to the people most impacted. And so, you know, what they also try to call divestment was moving the school safety agents back under the jurisdiction of the Department of Education. And that alone was $500 million, right? So they're saying, look, this is a $500 million cut. We're moving them over. But we know that the Department of Education has been paying for their salaries regardless. And a cop is a cop, no matter who they're getting training from, no matter who their boss is. A cop is a cop and doesn't belong in schools. And that's also just not divesting, because the communities they're not seeing that money. The $450 million that they're saying was cut and moved, it's not. Essentially, they're just putting another name on it. And that's also a challenge. I think the last challenge I'll really touch on is that right now we have 5,500 school safety agents, predominantly who are older Black women. And so there are folks who are like, we can't just lay off 5,500 employees in the middle of a pandemic, especially if they're Black women. And really, it's just like, what you should do and what you should always do, and what no one in New York City really can or wants to do apparently, is center the voice of young people. The young people will sit and do safety exercises very similar to what we spoke about in the beginning about thriving. Not once do they mention police or cops as a system of comfort or support. And so, you know, my thing is, you center the 1.1 million students for the first time and listen to what they're saying. And they're saying we don't want police in any capacity. Also, what you're saying is that these women who are safety agents said this is the best that they're able to do, is police and terrorize Black children who look like them and look like theirs, and they are more worthy of that. We don't need that, right? So where there was a big failure somewhere in the Department of Education out here, that folks ended up really using a safety agent position as a last resort, is like, you didn't invest and you didn't fund there either, you know, and now you're trying to make up for it by policing Black and brown young children and spending an obscene amount of money every year instead of really funding what they need and what they're looking for, which are guidance counselors, social workers, teachers who look like them, learning the history that looks like them. And so, you know, that's just a little bit of a brief picture of some wins and some challenges. But what I will say is that I'm always in awe and always just honored at the rage and the fierceness and the dedication and intentionality that the youth who lead these movements carry and have, even in the face of like every elected official telling them, you know, this isn't what we want to hear. Like, that doesn't burn out their fire to understand and believe that they are worthy of so much more, and safety, and that safety does not include police at all.
Yeah, thank you so much for that that response, and for highlighting some of the challenges and the wins. And I just want to pass it to you, Didi, for the same questions. You kind of started on that initially, but just some of the wins and barriers, wins, of course, and then if you could talk a bit more about kind of the challenges y'all been seeing in your local defund.
Yeah. Thank you for this. Yeah, I spoke to some of the wins, including like raising the minimum wage and organizing around participatory budgeting in our city, and having our folks on some of these decision-making kind of commissions. So in pretty much any city, there's the folks that are in the elected positions, but there's also lots of boards and commissions that also exist that make pretty high level decisions around city budgets, especially in Durham. And so we're also working with one of our tactics of getting more of our people to be in those board commissions, because they also develop the city budget. They make decisions around things that happen around the city, and yeah, they make decisions around a lot of stuff. And they're also able to make recommendations to our city council and to our county commissioners. And so really pushing for those spaces to also, as places of struggle, really moving those places to be more to the left, and to really move with the divest, invest framework continually. I think one of the challenges in North Carolina is that we have these preemption laws. So there are things that we probably would be able to pass in our city, but because we have so many state level preemption laws, and our state is ran by red, but our city is fairly blue. It creates a limitation and a barrier to even what our city council can do, and also shifts the terrain that we're able to organize on. And so we're not able to raise the minimum wage across our state, and our city is not able to raise the minimum wage across the city because of these preemption laws. And so our preemption is up this year, I believe. And so we're paying close attention to that, and organizing around them keep getting rid of the preemption and not voting to repeat it. And I think another challenge is like the narrative, especially in a small city in the South is that the police department has a large amount of jobs. Other than our hospital and the medical care services in Durham, the police department is pretty large, and so it just houses a lot of jobs that even if you are not interested in this type of work, you don't have many options. And so I think it's a challenge it's a challenge in terms of our ideology, in terms of people seeing the police as a job for people to have, and you'll be able to build wealth and take care of your family and do all of these things that are part of the American dream, and that the police department is a way of being able to do that. And so trying to consistently push on the delegitimization of the police is also what we have been talking about all night, is that when we say cops don't keep us safe, we are delegitimizing who they believe they are. You can talk to kids and they understand, if you ask them, especially Black children, how do you feel when you're around the cops? And generally they won't say that they feel safer. And I'm speaking this as someone that has nieces and nephews, and I ask them all the time, and this is not what they don't say that they feel safe. And so there's also the work of delegitimizing the police as a safe haven in our communities. But that also takes there being alternatives that are available for folks to deal with violence that happens in our communities at the interpersonal level, that people can call on, that is not the police, and that will not inflict more violence. And so those are the challenges that come to mind for me.
Thank you so much for that. And so I know we are, trying to wrap up soon, running out of time. This has been just so amazing. I have 2 more questions, and I just want to start with you, Don. Just if you could talk a little bit about how the federal cops program impacts the work you're doing, the local defund work, and then really just focusing on the connection the cops program has on incarceration and criminalization, both in your city and more broadly in the work y'all are doing to combat these things with National Council and at the National Council.
Okay. So just a couple of things. One, like the burn grants. And I know we mentioned this a little bit before, but they've been used to primarily finance drug task forces, and which we know that has a record of racially disproportionate drug arrests. And we know about the disproportionate sentencing for, like, for example, crack versus cocaine, etc., and the targeting of our communities. And it increased local and state costs with no measurable impact on public safety. And also, this was mentioned earlier, but was mentioned, but I want to drill into the Operation Relentless Pursuit, which also is out of this COPS funding as well, and that Trump's administration has launched it, and it's a boost of federal officers and task forces in these cities: Detroit, Albuquerque, Baltimore, Cleveland, Kansas City, Memphis, and Milwaukee. And so they got like $71 million for more cops, more equipment, and more. And so we remember the times where feds were coming through our communities and taking whole neighborhoods and locking whole neighborhoods up. And so that's what we're talking about, a resurgence of that, when especially we know, like, over the past 10 years, that we know that more incarceration and all of this aggressive policing has not kept us safer. So for example, in Tennessee, where I'm from, over the past 10 years, our incarceration rate has risen, and it's risen over the national average. And during that same, and we still have the 4th highest violent crime rate in the country, and a very high recidivism rate. But what's so noteworthy is that in that same period of time between 2018 to 2017, the states that have actually reduced their imprisonment have also, 34 states have reduced their imprisonment and reduced their crime rates in the same time. So all of this, like over policing, over incarceration, the incentives from these programs have not kept us safer at all. We have a very high violent crime rate. And so at National Council, in 2018, we had town halls in 21 different cities all across the country to really start envisioning, like, what do we need? What type of investment do we want? What do we want to see invested in? And that's how we formed our Reimagining Communities framework and began our work around participatory budgeting in hyper-local communities and creating community-led alternative systems to the police in our Transforming Harm project. And Transforming Harm, I just want to note also that what we've seen out of this funding is like the lifting up of victims, and it's a false dichotomy between like victim and the perpetrator, victim and the quote unquote offender. But our Transforming Harm project is led by formerly incarcerated women who have lost loved ones to violence and know still that police are not the answer, and what we need, and that we need to defend and protect our people. And so, you know, that's one of the things that kind of sometimes narratives that hold us back that are around, you know, there's going to be more victims, there's going to be more crime. But actually, if we invest in our communities and if we talk to victims, if they really think about it, then the police didn't really help them on their healing process. And we need to invest in like actually addressing harm, actually giving people real opportunities, like community-owned worker businesses. When our formerly incarcerated men and women, especially Black women, men and women, are the last to be hired and the first to be fired in these times. And so what are we expected to do? And so we just, these investments through the COPS funding program are rolling us backwards when we've seen overall that the over the years, time going towards decarceration, going towards defunding and less policing. And we're seeing in those places where that is done, actually seeing a lowering in crime and communities coming together and figuring it out.
Word. Thank you so much for that, Don, and just you know, reminding us that more policing and more money spent on policing incarceration is not keeping us safe, and that it will continue to fail our communities and continues to fail to address harm. But like folks are working on real solutions to actually like address harm and prevent it. And so, Jackie, I want to ask you the same question before we move on to the last question. But just what. How does the federal COPS program impact in your local defund work? And what connection does this have to incarceration and criminalization in Nashville? And you're on mute, Jackie.
It's all about the dollars, where the dollars are flowing and the kind of policing culture that's being supported in our community. So we need those dollars that are coming into our community to support the harmful services that the policing system delivers to cease. And we need other dollars, that will come into our communities, our neighborhoods, to build up and to position people in better and safer places. We need more resources in our schools for our children, as opposed to law enforcement personnel in there. We could have teachers' assistants, smaller classrooms. Someone mentioned more social workers and counselors. That's how that money needs to be spent, as opposed to the way that it's presently being spent. And I wanted to make one quick comment, Erica, when you mentioned, successes and challenges. I think one of the greatest successes that we've seen in Nashville is so much pressure was applied to our council. So many voices were being heard in our community that our police chief, who has been in power, and when I say in power, I mean in power, for what, 40 years? Although he has not resigned, the intent is for him to resign, I guess, around October. But that just lets us know that we need to continue to apply the pressure, and we also need to apply pressure to move him out of any influence on who the next police chief is going to be, because I think he intends to be a puppet master, and we have to apply enough pressure to make sure that that does not happen. And maybe we need to pull in a police chief from outside the city of Nashville, so he doesn't have, that kind of in reach into the policing culture that we're trying to get rid of.
Word, thank you so much for that, Jackie. And so I just wanna, the last question, y'all, we got like a few minutes left. Just if y'all could very quickly just name, what does a defund movement make possible for your vision to redefine public safety in your community? And we can do a popcorn style, whoever's feel the spirit first, please come with it.
I can kick us off. And so Defund makes possible for us here in New York City many things. Here in New York City, as I'm sure in many other places in the country, we're really battling two pandemics. We're battling COVID-19, we're battling police terror, and every day is waking up and not knowing what's gonna happen. So this is a life that I'm sure a lot of us are living, but defunding the police means, and removing police from schools is almost starting over, being able to, whenever schools opened up and folks are still harboring and carrying all the trauma that's been brought by COVID, all the trauma that's been brought before COVID, you have an opportunity to welcome students back in a culture that is nourishing, in a culture that says, I care about you and your well-being. Asada Shakur, whose birthday it is today, happy birthday, says really that schools are really a reflection of the society that created them. And our society over and over and over just tends to tell us that Black children especially are not worthy of love and support. And we know that's not the case. And we know that the young people are going to continue to show up for that. They deserve restorative practices. They deserve mental health support. We know violence looks and feels extremely different. And so if our folks have food to eat and a livable wage and homes that are not falling apart and teachers who look like them and who care about their success, we absolutely don't need police, not in schools, not in the streets. We need each other, and the money exists. We just got to make sure that money comes back to us. If we took the $450 million that we give every year to school safety agents and divided that up by New York City's like 1,600 public school, each school would get $282,000 extra a year that we know is not only enough, but is money that should be going there to begin with. And so, just again, super grateful for being able to kick it with y'all tonight, really repping the badass youth leaders out here in New York City. I grew up as a young person in my org and in my coalition, and I'm now an organizer supporting young people who look like me and who are still, unfortunately, in 2020, living the same life that I lived 17 years ago in high school. So definitely, it's not invest, divest, just to remind folk, unless that money is actually reinvested into communities. And in this case, police-free schools are not police-free unless we remove police from them completely and really, really give the young people what they deserve. So thank y'all so much.
I'll jump in real quick. I can imagine the infinite possibilities of what we could do with the funds that are being put into law enforcement. Imagine, as opposed to a law enforcement officer in a school, that we mental health professionals who could serve as mentors, also guidance counselors, young adults that students could relate to. What a difference that would make, as opposed to someone standing in uniform with a gun on their head.
Thank you so much for that, Jackie and Audie. Don, Dee, few words. What's it make possible?
I mean, another world is possible for us here in the United States and across the global South. I think that it also shows that abolition is possible. A world without prisons, jails, juvenile detention, ICE facilities is possible. We've lost funding, and we're not considered for funding before for just being downright abolitionists and don't care. And now, it's a time when it's a time where abolition has come and it's becoming mainstream. People are really having a radical reimagining of what can happen. So it's time, a time without police, without prisons, without cages, and a time when we're really invested in, really whole, where our communities are healed, is possible, and it's here.
And I think, I think the main thing is, like, the police have always had what they needed, and our communities have not. And that's like what we've been speaking to all night, and especially with Dawn and Addie and Jackie raised around, like, what is more possible when we do have what we need is actually a real opportunity to thrive and to build a liberated world that doesn't rely on the exploitation and the violence of other people. So everybody said everything.
Thank y'all. Y'all have been amazing. So grateful for the work y'all are doing in your local communities and across the nation to really invest in our communities to create whole and vibrant communities. So love to y'all. And so just want to kind of wrap this up by talking a little bit about some action steps folks can take locally. If you're not involved in a local campaign yet, want to invite y'all into some local work. But again, thank y'all so much, Jackie, Don, Audie, Dee, for the beautiful and amazing work and for inspiring us and, like, showing us the way. And so if we can go to the next slide. Next slide. Thank y'all so much. So what you can do at the local level. So shout out to us for doing local work. And so we want to invite y'all into that. And so first, you can kind of start off by demanding that your local and municipal elected officials reduce police budgets and shift resources to community priorities. Refuse to accept federal dollars that continue increasing police budgets. We can also refuse funding and equipment used to further militarize police departments. Next slide. And additionally, a few folks kind of asked in the comment box or in the question box what work you can be doing and how folks can look into their local budgets. And so just want to provide some resources. I think we can put it into the chat box or question somewhere. We'll figure it out. But there are a few databases that we've been using to assess the COPS program impact on our local budgets. And so some of that is a policing database by the Thurgood Marshall Institute. We'll include a link to that. The cost of policing that is being held by ACRE. And then also, that's the last one. And then just want to invite folks to get involved into a local organization that is doing the very worthy and meaningful work of defunding cops and cages. And so now I'm going to pass it back to Tracy for a kind of exit poll to see where folks are now. And so I'll pass it back to you, Tracy.
Thank you so much, Erica. And I just want to say thank you so much to this panel. As I told you, this panel was going to be delicious and juicy and amazing, and I believe that they were. So just want to honor that. And so I want to bring back up the poll that we did before. And I want to ask the question again. I feel like I learned a lot. which is important for when we do these teach-ins, and I'm hoping that you learned a lot. And so I want to put up that poll again to see the exact same question that we asked before, to see if you feel any differently from when we started. So if someone can throw that poll up for us, and tell us, how comfortable do you feel talking about the connection between Defund and the Defund movement and the COPS program? And we're about 70% of the way there. So just letting people go ahead and answer for us. I'm gonna give it about 10 more seconds. We're about 77%. If we can get to 80, I'm gonna end the poll. So if you haven't answered, please go ahead and answer for us. Almost there. Okay, y'all. So I want to share these results, and I want to just talk about how exciting it is that one person, and please let us know so we can answer more questions for you. But we started off very, very split, where we had about 33% of folks saying they were not comfortable talking about this. And now we are down to 1%, and folks are feeling very comfortable. And so there was a question that was put in the chat about, what do we do? How do we build this? And I think that you just answered this question. This is how we build this, having more conversations with each other, finding out who shares your analysis, and helping grow that organization, that movement, that collective, so that other people are rooted the same way that we are. Like I said, a lot of times our people are really only given two options. We're given safety via cop, and we know that that's not how we keep us safe. So again, want to make sure that folks are really looking at this poll to see that once we have these conversations, once we dig deep, we know the answers. We keep us safe. We understand how to do this. And I'm so excited that we were able to have this conversation tonight, and looking forward to being a community and movement with you in the future. So I'm going to throw it over to Kamal and to HP.
Make sure I'm off mute. Cool. Peace, everybody. My name is Kamau. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the campaign coordinator for People's Coalition for Safety and Freedom. I'm incredibly grateful that everybody has made time to be with us today. We're really excited to build more with you over the coming months. So as Tracy and Dave and a lot of folks have said, the COPS program is only one component of the 1994 crime bill. The bill is incredibly expansive, and it touches every aspect of this country's carceral web. So the goal of our coalition is to shift our justice and safety paradigm to one of community investment, healing, and restoration, and away from punishment, mass criminalization, and mass incarceration, and repealing the 1994 crime bill and redirecting federal resources away from all the relevant punitive programs is necessary to achieve this goal. So the replacement legislation, which we believe will redirect these federal resources, will be envisioned and developed through the participation of the people that are most harmed by policing, criminalization, and incarceration. So in order to do that, this coalition is engaging in what we're calling the people's process. I'm going to pass it now to HP, my colleague, who's going to talk a little bit more about what the people's process is going to be and how folks can get plugged in.
Thank you, Kamau. Hey, y'all. My name is Harmony Phoenix. If you say Harmony, please say Phoenix, or HP, and I am the National People's Process Organizer. The People's Coalition for Safety and Freedom intends to co-create and execute a process of actually asking the people what they envision for a world without the 94 crime bill and the ramifications of it. and the restoration and investment into direct active communities to think about all kids of the world. So could you go to the next slide? Thank you. These are some of the people's process and how we offer folks. We want to capitalize on national attention to repealing the 1994 crime bill with proposals that come out of the people's process. We want to center the stories and expertise of communities and individuals most impacted, support local power and capacity, and support ongoing local work. We want to engage in mass political abolition-centered education for folks to deepen, develop, and transform their understanding of the prison industrial complex. We want to engage participatory democratic process. We want language and priority investments for the replacement of the 1994 crime bill that will reverse the impact and reduce the footprint of incarceration. We want to imagine alternatives to incarceration and safety and bring people together to assess what actually keeps us safe outside of the carceral state. And we also want to make sure that we're accounting for the harms and failures of the 1994 crime bill. Go to the next slide. So if you were excited about it, I was like, okay, so how do I get involved in this? I'm a directly impacted person. I'm a community with directly impacted people. I hear about being in a carceral free state, how I get plugged in. This is how you do. You can follow our Instagram. It's listed here, People's Coalition, and our Twitter. And look out for more toolkits like the Defund program. If you're part of an organization, organization engaged in criminal transformation, abolition focused work, and are you interested in co-creating and reimagining what safety means? And if you are, you should fill out the bit.ly in the chat. It's bit.ly/capital I interest, capital PP. And if you fill that form out, I will reach out back to you and we can talk about how we can best in collaboration to the people's process. And I will pass it back to Jason.
Yes, thank you all so much. Again, I feel so privileged to have spent this time with you tonight. Again, if you have any interest, please fill out that link. It's bit.ly/interest PP. And if you check with bit.ly, it's really important to look at the capitalization and come throw down with us. That's how we win. And I know, as Dee Dee said, another world is not only possible, but it is in progress, and we're going to build it together. This is being recorded, so it will be available on our site soon. We are asking that you share it far and wide. Follow us on Instagram, follow us on Twitter, and let's win. Y'all have a great night. Thank you so much.